Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome. I'm so glad to be able to present Kitty Snyman this morning. She's a sister of our revered chair lady. Kitty was also born in Zimbabwe, or as Rhodesia it was then, where she finished her schooling before going to Stellenbosch University, where she graduated. After a career in teaching in Zimbabwe, Cape Town and England, she returned to Stellenbosch University and took up the post of sports organizer and a hockey coach at the US Sports Office. Tempted by her wanderlust, she took off for a 2-year backpacking adventure through South and North America and Europe, ending on a kibbutz in Israel before returning to South Africa. Kitty then briefly took up the job again at the University Sports Office before resigning and then joining Mr. Marty Geldnys as the manager at Marty's Travel in Stellenbosch for 8 years. Then, tempted back to teaching, she went on to lecture in tourism at the Cape Town University of Technology. This was followed by working as the general manager and editor of the GSA magazine, aimed at the travel industry for 3 years. At this point, she decided to start her own business. So in 1994, Kitty returned to the travel industry and started Rufaro Travel, which later changed its name to Rufaro Destination Management, which is still operating. She's extremely well traveled, and after many years of wonderful experiences, she is now prepared to share this with us. Kitty, thank you very much, and we're looking forward to this.
Good morning, all. I know that many of you are also very well traveled and seasoned travelers, but I hope that you'll find my journey interesting. Looking back, I can't believe 40 years has gone so quickly. And of course, one could get stuck all the way in the various things that you've missed. But I'll just quickly start with the milestones that happened along the way. As Letitia said, we did travel like all of people had holidays when we were young. From Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, we used to go on holiday. And while I was teaching and lecturing, of course, we had lots of time to go on holiday, but something happened and I decided somewhere in 1980 that I wanted something else. I was restless. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with the rest of my future. And so I dared to take on the most adventurous journey of my life. I know today that restlessness has a name, and it's called wanderlust. And my wanderlust has taken me far and comes from the pure desire to just see new places and people. So I'll start with the adventure, which is the backpacking. And then you've heard I joined the travel industry, which opened wonderful opportunities in travel. Then when I joined the GSA, I was fortunate enough to go to India as a travel journalist. So I'll be showing you some of that. And then I started Rufaro, my own company. And that gave me the opportunity to attend travel workshops, to go and give travel workshops in the States and in India a couple of times, the States a couple of times, but that cost money. Then I've been invited on travel educationals where basically everything's paid for you, to Malaysia, to the USA, places in Europe and Australia. So I was very privileged to be able to do that and have been privileged. A very interesting milestone was also the time I spent 4 or 5 years traveling with British American Tobacco from Vietnam, and they were VIP travelers. They paid for all my expenses to join them. They came to South Africa. I traveled with them in Europe and in the States. I had the opportunity of doing the travel arrangements to the King of Nepal, and that was a whole experience, adventure on itself. He arrived here with a whole Boeing full of ammunition. I think he was wanting to skip the country. But anyway, that was interesting to do that. And then we've done, and are still doing the Marita van der Vyver tours. Marita is one of renowned Afrikaans writers, very popular. And we do tours in France, Taste of Provence mostly. We've been to Cuba and Morocco and so on. We were meant to go to India this year, or last year, but of course it was cancelled. And then I'm very, very honored and privileged to be one of 120 wine tour operators in the world that gets invited to France every second year, all expenses paid, and we travel around the French, different provinces and vineyards. Okay, so there we are. With very little money and just an urge to see the world, and restless. We knew we had to find casual work. When I say I started going off, and then a friend joined me in South America, and we traveled together until we met another friend in America. And when you have no fixed agenda, not much money, you know you're going to have to start work. So that happened along the way. Started in Argentina because it was easy in those days, going back to the 80s, to fly directly. And we flew from Ecuador to Miami. And I've skipped through a lot of many interesting places that in the world and in South America, but I've concentrated on where the experience stood out for me. I flew from Boston to London. We traveled overland to Europe and returned from Israel to London and then home to South Africa. So 2 years. And traveling through South America, all those highlights. I mean, they're wonderful places. One can talk on each one of those: Machu Picchu, the Iguazu Falls, Buenos Aires as a city, Rio, and so on, Torres del Paine in the south, down here, and Patagonia. These are all wonderful places, but I've decided that I'd just stick to the highlights, the things that really stood out for me. You can just see the route that most people take when they go through South America, and that's flying, but we didn't. My first stop was Bariloche, where I actually was meant to meet my friend from Cape Town. And remember, we didn't have cell phones then at all, and Heather was delayed by 3 days. I didn't know. There was nowhere. I just walked out to the airport, which was 5 kilometers, it was 10 kilometers every day to see whether she arrived. Eventually she did. Anyway, so Bariloche, one of the highlights, popular cities in Argentina, and it looks like Switzerland. You can't believe that it's a South American city. It's famous for its chocolate, stuck in the middle of nowhere. Puerto Montt on the Chilean side, beautiful lakes between them, that's worth seeing. So I did that trip, crossed from Puerto Varas. It was a full day trip from coach to ferry to coach to boat. It's absolutely fantastic and well worth doing. Went through 3, but there's 6 lakes in this lake district of Chile, and each lake has a totally different color. So that gives you an idea of how fantastic it is just to see the wild nature and travel through these glaciers. The next highlight of Bariloche was the Isla Victoria and the Arianas forest. Now, Isla Victoria, I got to because I managed to get to know the ranger of the national park and managed to go and stay with him in Isla Victoria, and there fantastic things happened. But it's got a myrtle tree, which is called the Arianas, a whole forest of them, which is only found in Chile and Argentina. So that was the jetty coming in, and that was the log cabin I stayed in while I was there for about 3 weeks. The highlight of that experience was seeing this little fawn being born here. It is a little pudu fawn, and the zookeepers from the New York Zoo had been running a rehabilitation center and a breeding center in Isla Victoria to try and reestablish this breed of deer. They're the smallest deer in the world, and this is the little fawn that was born while I was there. So that was a very special experience and great celebration in this forest when this little thing was born. And then a big skip over all those other wonderful cities, because the next really adventurous thing we did was go to Ecuador to try to get to the Amazon. But just pausing in Ecuador, the Bolivian and the Ecuadorian Indians are very, very interesting. They're very colorful, and the hats are important. Every tribe has a different hat. And so it's quite fun to try and recognize each country and each tribe. One of the main tribes in Ecuador are the Quechua, and there they are in their traditional clothing. Quito was for me a wonderful city with the big snow mountains behind it, and it was also one of the UNESCO cities. So we started in Quito and managed to go down the Amazon. So we thought we could afford to do it, but we couldn't. We were horrified to see how much US dollars. So we just took a bus, local bus, and then got to this Puerto Mizuali. And from there, we had to take local canoes down to Tenor, where we had to fly out, and that was the local canoes. There was no, I mean, there are wonderful boats on the river, but we had to do it the local way, which was very interesting. It took us 3 nights and 4 days, and we were fortunate enough to be able to fly out of Tenor. There happened to be a plane that was taking, somebody had died. We didn't know that until we got on the plane. We were given our tickets at the back of a bakkie, and on the plane, they were actually flying a dead person back to Quito, but we managed to get on that flight. So we got out of the Amazon. And from there, the next step was to get to America, and that was where we bought a car. Letitia shared in that car later. I think we bought it for $200, and 9 months later sold it for $200. What was fun was we had to laugh at the small tent, that because often it was easier just to sleep in the car than put up the tent. But that's how we traveled through America. The highlights in America will be the national parks. It's the easiest way, the most convenient way to travel, hassle-free. There are over 400 national parks, and they're just wonderful. Sometimes they're free if you walk in as a backpacker, but it's certainly a way to get to see parts of the natural beauty of America. We started down here in Miami and did the Everglades. I've never seen so many mosquitoes, never. They literally was like a whole beehive got stuck on your back when you were jogging in the morning. And that's why the bird life is so fantastic thing. Then trying to get to New York, where I had to pick up some money, hopefully. I'd sent some money to pick up in Miami, but it was impossible to get it. So we had to go to New York, pass through the Great Smoky Mountains, which is absolutely super. Shenandoah, and I mean, one could spend slides just on showing each one of these national parks and how beautiful they are. The variety of natural beauty in America and the national parks is absolutely unbelievable. And then we went from New York back to the Arches National Park, through back to Bryce Canyon and the Grand Canyon, where we hiked down to the ranch at the bottom and back. It was absolutely scenic. It was as hot as hell down in the canyon, but when we got up, it was snowing. Rocky Mountains. From there, we went to the Sequoia National Park, and then on to Yosemite, Redwoods, then Yellowstone. And from Yellowstone, Letitia also joined us there. We then went back to Oregon and Seattle, where we dropped off Letitia, and the next trip to the next part of the adventure to try and make some money, which was the Bering Sea. We had to get to Dutch Harbor. Now that was an amazing way. I mean, we just got further and further away from civilization. We started in Anchorage and flew to Dutch Harbor in a small plane, and then even in a smaller plane, one of those seaplanes that land on skis, to a little island, and there we had to wait on the beach while they came and fetched us in a rubber duck, and then we went to the factory that was moored there. So that was packing crabs in Alaska. We were so desperate for money, took the chance, but it was absolutely amazing. Most people on the boat, on the floating factory, which you can see just slightly at the back there, one of them, were Filipinos, but we managed to get work illegally, but we got it. And that is a king crab. They only eat the legs of the king crab. I'm going to just play a short bit of this video just to give you some idea.
Icicle offers more than 10 facilities, including 5 floating processors in the state of Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. Located in the frigid waters, in the extremities of America's untamed state, working for Icicle won't be your typical 9-to-5 job.
This is a Bering Star. We're a barge with Icicle. Right now we're processing Pacific cod.
If it has to do with Alaskan seafood, then we do it at Icicle.
We start in January, and we do cod and then crab.
And those are the crabs.
And herring and then salmon.
The boats go out and get the Pacific cod, and then they bring it in. We process it, freeze it, and ship it off to the buyer.
The boats that go out on these floating factories that we were in go out about 150 miles. But it was absolutely amazing because the boats would go out, and those were the guys that made a lot of money. But they literally would be strapped to the deck because the waves would come over, and they used to harvest or catch these. It would be like seeing cattle graze at the bottom of the the seabed, and they would go out and bring them back, and then they would be butchered and sent. Most of the things were sent to Japan. Anyway, then after making some money there, we had time to spend. I visited Letitia in England, and then a friend joined me, and we're from South Africa, and he and I traveled to Italy, and then to Greece, and eventually to Israel. And all the time we backpacked and hiked in Greece to get around. We ended up going to Crete to pick grapes. And there it was like sitting like our laborers here, that casual laborers wanting to get a job as a painter or whatever. You just wait for the farmer to come and pick you up, and then you go off to work on their farm. And so I worked with these people. We slept on the roof of their little cottage, no running water. I think we were given a jug of water a day to do everything you needed to do because it's so scarce. And then we'd be having food, lunch, break for lunch. So that was really interesting to get down to. And then we later helped them to also pick olives. And from there, we obviously had to head to Israel. I've always been fascinated by Israel. But it was also to make some money, because we were paid, I think, $1 a day by working on a kibbutz. So my kibbutz, Malea Hamisha, was here near Jerusalem. And we got time off. I think you got, for every 2 weeks, you got a day off or something. So it gave me a lot of time to just use the local buses and travel to Haifa. We got to the Golan Heights later. I later returned with another friend and traveled by car, but at this time it was just using the local buses and hiking down with some fellow kibbutzniks down to through Beersheba, where the market was, down to Eilat. So it gave us a lot of time to get to know and see Israel, and to get to know the Israelis, who call themselves Sabra, tough on the outside but soft on the inside. And this, just to give you an idea, I did take lots of pictures, but they didn't come out too well, of how the promised land looked when the Israelis or the Jews got there. And you could never forget it. This is what my kibbutz looks like today, but it didn't look like that when I was there. But because that's now, gosh, 40 years ago. They just have this ability to make something of barren earth. And that was interesting to talk to people who'd actually started the kibbutz and their experience. And then Jerusalem, of course, is just one of those places that has this very special feel to it. It is a spiritual place, and just walking around there, you know that you are in a religious, I mean, all the major religions have something in Jerusalem. And then Eilat in the south, the Israeli beach resort, which is a total different field at the end of the Negev desert. After that, I came home back to South Africa. One of the first trips I had at Rufaro was a thing that I paid for a lot of money. I started working, and it was a dream that I've always had to get to Antarctica. Don't ask me why, because I'm not good on water. I got sick just crossing the English Channel with a totally calm sea. But this was something that I felt I would like to do. We joined a Russian icebreaker from Ushuaia that went down to the peninsula. They never get to the actual South Pole, only get to that part of the peninsula. So we went down on the Drake's Passage, absolutely 36 hours of just seasick, Fortunately, when you come back via Cape Horn, it's not so bad. That was us leaving Ushuaia, and that was the Professor Moltanovsky that we went on, a Russian icebreaker. At one point in the peninsula, boat could not go any further, and the captain then said, if you now want to go further, you must get out and walk. That's how far we'd got into the ice. Just to give you another idea of places that you can go to as a tourist. And then an interesting thing, and while we were there, we thought of what is the difference between the Arctic and the Antarctic? And they are different, which is obvious if you know it. The Arctic is a sea, a frozen sea surrounded by land. And the Antarctic is frozen land surrounded by sea. And it actually makes your perception very different. You feel very isolated in Antarctica. You never do in the Arctic when you're sailing around looking at polar bears. But Antarctica has a very special effect. The beauty of this trip was absolutely something to remember.
Port side, just to list some doubles, please.
When people come to Antarctica, it's not uncommon for them to feel like it is a dream. When you ask someone, describe your experience. What is it like to be here? They'll say things like, is this real? For the first couple of days, everything is vivid. You're visiting an area that is equally marine and mountain. And this creates an incredible experience as well as an incredible natural dynamic to witness. As you sit in a zodiac, floating at sea, near seals, near penguins, ice in almost every direction, giving that feeling of pure wilderness. As a traveler, maybe you do research on what it is like to be in Antarctica. You learn about a few sites, wildlife, history.
And you've got to leave the ship.
And it begins to build your frame of reference about this place. And then you get here. It's so brilliant that those pieces of information that you gathered are completely washed over by the immediacy of the experience of being here. The cold on your face,
Just as a traveler, you feel totally bewildered. One of the nice things is that if you can get on the boat, that is a hot spring in one of the volcanic lakes that we managed to get to. So it's 2 degrees outside, but you're sitting there in boiling water, really. You have to be careful because it's volcanic. The volcano erupts and you could actually be burnt by these hot bubbles that come out. But that was a very welcome relief. It wasn't too cold, in fact. It snowed on Christmas Day for us, but for the rest, it was cold, but very seldom snowing. And then to go on to the next highlight of my travel so far was India. I went there first of all as a journalist, Mnet, and a couple of Mnet producers, and then the media from journalists from newspapers. So we were extremely well treated the first time. I've been to India 5 times now. Some I paid for, but this was treated like royalty. And so my feeling, it can only be described as this. It is not a country, but a continent. From the frozen summits to the Himalayas to Kerala, which is down here in the south, which is a total different feeling. If you walk in the streets of any city in India, you rub shoulders with representatives of the world's great faiths, encounter temple rituals and quirky echoes of the British area on virtually every corner. And unlike many other countries, that part of the colonial empire, the Indians don't have a problem. They very proudly show what they enjoy or have left of the British. So mostly people start in Delhi and they do the Golden Triangle, which is Delhi, Jaipur, Udaipur. When I do the tours, we also include Mumbai. Goa is totally different. It's like a Catholic little country on its own. And just across the way, Chennai, which is totally Hindu. So it is just like many countries in a country. India has always had a strange way with her conquerors. In defeat, she beckons them in, then slowly seduces. She assimilates and transforms them. I mean, and that's exactly the color. There's nothing subtle about India. It hits you full on. Your eyes, your ears, there's always noise. There's always music. There's always a celebration. Hot curries and architecture that is just amazing. And I've been back, as I said, 5 times, also as an expo, once as an invitation, and then another 3 times going as an expo where I had to go and sell South Africa, and then another time as a holiday. And every time you can't leave India without feeling something's changed in you. The next adventure from one in my own travel business was going to Cuba. We went to Mexico, and then I thought, gosh, we're so close when we were in Cancun, we might as well go to Cuba. So we managed to get across, and that must have been about 1990. And Cuba was totally amazing because it is really a communist country, and it's a third world country, but it grows on you. We've started the first time from Havana and hired a car to go down to Trinidad, which is one of the old colonial cities. It took forever. The roads are terrible. There were no road maps, no directions, no road signs. You never knew where you were going, except there was one highway. But to get out of Havana, it took us at least 2 hours. And eventually, because nobody could speak English, and they still don't really much, we had to ask, and we ended up on a highway, and we thought, gosh, here we at last, and that highway just ended in a mealy land. So it was quite difficult to get out of Havana. And when you need somebody, they're not there. Later, when I went back, we did Havana to Trinidad to Cienfuegos, across to Pinar del Rio and the Benares Valley, which is where the tobacco is. This is where the music actually started from, the African part of Santiago, which is that's the start of the music that Cuba is so well known for. And this little bird is the bee hummingbird. It's the smallest bird in the world. And you can see how it sits. It practically can fit on your fingernail. So very weird things, animals that you only find in Cuba. I mean, the alligator is also, it's threatened, but it's more dangerous than our crocodiles. So very interesting things you discover in Cuba. The last time I was there, we stayed the best accommodation we could get, but that doesn't say much. And of course, there you've got the cigar, rum and cigars that everyone tries. The food was when we first went boring and uneatable. The second time round, it was also boring, but a bit better. It's a communist country and a third world country in many ways, but it's stuck in time. But what was interesting to discover is that somehow it works. The people are not unhappy. They have free education, free medical aid and hospitals, regulated wages, a basic food supply. Everybody gets a quota of food every single day if you're working. Very equal. You can be the manager of a hotel and you could be the room maid. You're paid exactly the same. The government controls the salary. So you pay the same irrespective of your position, which of course leads to people now learning that they can get tips. And so somebody who gives you your scrambled egg at breakfast asks for a tip, because that's the only way they can make money. The government controls all the industry. Most of the hotels belong to the government, and if they don't, they pay a high levy, which is why Trump was so anti about the support, or the Americans, because the money goes to the military. But they own the tourism. Also, farming is controlled. You were given land, you don't own it, but it's given to you to farm, and you cannot grow potatoes. But growing potatoes is not allowed in Cuba. We don't know why. It had something to do with, it's a way of making rum or a liquor. When the Russians were there, it wasn't allowed, so still not. The only place you get it is in tourist restaurants. You can have cattle, but you're not allowed to have the meat. The cattle gets only sold to the government, and they supply the restaurants. Ordinary Cubans don't eat much beef. They eat pork or chicken. Milk, you can have cows, you can milk them, but it has to be sold to the government, except for your own use, and the government sets the price. So it was very interesting to find out how people live and what they're allowed to do. So on the surface, it looks okay, and people look happy. They say if they've got their rum and their cigars, they're happy. So I've said unspoiled Cuba, because in many ways it is unspoiled because of the sanctions they've had from America. Havana is a UNESCO site, but you walk down one beautifully restored street, and the next street, it could just collapse and fall on you. So a very interesting experience. It's rapidly evolving now into a popular tourist destination. At the moment, very difficult to get to because they also have COVID, and to try and get there with flights is practically impossible. So a lot can happen in a short time. They're hardworking, they're poor. The best time to go to Cuba is now, before the Americans get there. I said that when we went 30 years ago, and you can see there's been a lot of change, but it's still not spoiled by Americans. The next highlight for me in Africa was in Morocco, and it is genuinely exotic. A Muslim country, but it's a very tolerant Muslim atmosphere. They are devout and they're disciplined, but you still have to be careful as women or anybody, but mostly women. You don't really walk around on your own, and you don't easily speak to strangers in the city, especially Marrakesh and Fez in their markets. So we started in Casablanca and to Rabat. Next trip I did, we went to the blue city up here, Chefchaouen. Fez and Marrakesh are the two big cities with markets, but Fez has become too crowded and it's become quite dangerous. They all warn you about walking around on your own at Fez, but we did. And then to cross the Atlas Mountains is absolutely amazing. It's a different world. It's very green. I was amazed how green Morocco is until you cross the Atlas Mountains, and then it's this harsh desert, not quite Sahara, but very much like that. So that's the trip that I've done twice, with first Mauritius tour and then a group of friends from Rabat. Casablanca is the easiest to fly into. Rabat, the capital, it's a very nice green city. And then the ruins at Meknes, Fez. The minute you start crossing the desert, it becomes a different experience. Back to Marrakesh. And this is the riads I stay in, the tours that we did. These are riads, and they are restored traditional guest houses. Absolutely beautiful and much cheaper than staying, and much more real than staying in Western hotels. And it's like, part of the time, it's like being back in biblical times. The people are still doing the things that they'd always done. They're very poor. The only problem is that the literacy is very low. Other than Cuba, where it's very high, in Morocco, women aren't, and girls aren't really educated. They'd rather, especially in the outlying areas, they rather have to work at home and get married early. So there's a big drive in NGOs in Morocco to get schooling for girls. And this is the part of the Blue City. And there's Atlas Mountain, and that was the highest point. We drove up in snow like you couldn't believe. You could have been skiing in Switzerland. So that was at the top, going down, going up and coming back, it was snow. And then you get to the other side and you've got these date palms and old cities. And of course, everybody wants to do a camel ride. We spent a night in the camp in the dunes, and it's quite a strenuous camel ride. It's really a camel ride. It's not like going around a couple of blocks on a camel. It's about a 1.5 hour trip. And then I'm going to end with something close to home, Kenya, which I did with the first time with Letitia. Well, the first time I went to just check it out. I think we were the very first group that went into Kenya when South Africans were first allowed. We were allowed to get visas. And it was a group of 20, mostly farmers from Grabo and Elgin and friends and family. And when I asked on a previous trip to the agent in Kenya, Nairobi, whether we could hire cars, because I know that South Africans, we all like to do our own thing. He was absolutely amazed that we didn't want drivers, because he said, nobody drives, no tourists can drive, the roads are too bad. And they were. The roads are absolutely, there are no roads. I mean, they're tracks. So the first trip we did, we went on a camel safari near here, near Sambura. And it was really walking. It was walking with the camels carrying the luggage. And every night, we camp on the side of the river with everything hot and cold provided. Very basic, but absolutely amazing. And from then we went back to Nairobi, and then by car to Lake Nakuru and Masai Mara. And that was an amazing road journey. I think nobody wanted to do that. One lady actually just sat on the floor of the car and refused to look. And on that note, we then picked up our car in Nairobi and went to Amboseli National Park, drove through Tsavo, down to Mombasa and Diani Beach, where we stayed at Mzambweni. So it was a wonderful contrast of hiking and walking with the camels. You actually get fond of the camels at night. The noise they make, the groaning and the moaning, they're such angry animals. And then the experience of the Masai Mara, and then to relax for a week on these private cottages that we got, villas actually, in Mombasa, Diani. So that's a typical picture of Kenya and safari. I've subsequently been back again. We were treated in a very special way while we were on the camel safari. These Maasai that were looking after the herd of camels just spontaneously one night came and danced for us. It was absolutely fantastic. Masai Mara, still one of the highlights and main favorite places of visiting in Kenya. And so that gives you an idea of the camels and the river. And then at Mzambweni, when we were there in 1990, this villa didn't have the pool. You just walked onto the beach, which was here, but that's what it looks like now. We hired about 1 to 3 of these cottages, and the kids loved it. They were all in one on their own, with their own chef, their own cook, their own house attendant, and the askari who guarded the properties with his bow and arrow every night. So that was a wonderful first trip into Africa for us when we were allowed to go. And then now, if any of you are thinking of traveling in the future, they've done a survey in Australia, America, England, and Europe. And 70% of the people said they will spend more money on travel in 2022. 78% said the money they saved not traveling during COVID will boost their travel budget for this next year, and 64% when they travel again, their budget will increase for the remainder of this year in comparison to the past 2 years. So if we're allowed to travel again, hopefully there will be a boom, and I certainly will appreciate it, because at the moment there is no business. And so thank you for listening to me. I hope I gave you some places of interest that you might not have been to or experienced that way. And as Richard Quest says, it's a world of wonder. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Kitty. Thank you very much. And I'm sure there are many other places that you visited, but can also share some experiences. Don't you want to say something about Russia and China quickly?
Yes, Russia was interesting. And in fact, we were due to go again now, but we had to put it off because we aren't allowed. Russia is not open for tourists, and South Africans are certainly not allowed. I actually took a group for a company, and we did the cruise from St. Petersburg to Moscow on the waterways, which was absolutely super because everything is packed just in one, you get on a ship and you don't have to pack and unpack. And we were one of the first also at that time going, and Russia had just opened to South Africa. So it was very raw, and while we were there, the ruble was devalued, and it was heartbreaking to see people who'd lost all their savings. A teacher, qualified teacher, and her daughter and son-in-law. The son-in-law was a doctor on the ship, and his wife was one of our guides. The three of them lived with their kid in one bedroom flat, and they could not afford it. And when the ruble collapsed, I don't know what happened to them. I mean, it was terrible. But an interesting country, sailing through the country, expansive views and fields. You just thought if somebody could just work on it, everything is there. If it wasn't communist, it could really work. People are demotivated or unmotivated to work because, like in Cuba, no matter what you do, you pay the same salary. So the food that time was also not great. I mean, it's very different now. Moscow and St. Petersburg have become world cities. It wasn't then. It was interesting to see Moscow, and of course the underground, that's world renowned. I mean, it's like walking in a palace. And St. Petersburg, to see the museums. So that was interesting. And China, yeah, I'm not fond of China. I mean, I was in China. I'll do it to see things, but when you really want to experience, you need to be able to talk to people and not just see. And so for China, it was very difficult when I was there because everything I asked, the guide would say, the government says. So you were told what the government wanted her to know. And I got so tired of eating in these big tourist dining rooms. I one day told him just to stop and let me get out. And she was terrified. And that wasn't too long ago. They don't like you to ask questions, get off the itinerary.
Thank you, Kitty. Anybody else who wants to ask a question? I'm sure many of you have also had amazing experiences you might want to share with Kitty.
Yes, I'm sure you have. I mean, I feel like such a fraud because, I mean, travel is such an exciting thing. But when you think back, some things always stick out. And it's, for example, Vietnam, I think is fantastic. Vietnam, to me, it's a beautiful country, lovely people. They are so polite. And the food is exquisite. So that in itself was also a wonderful memory. And I would happily do that again.
Kitty, perhaps you could just tell them why your business is called Rufaro.
Because you gave it that name. I left the GSA and the family, they were all in Mana pools in Zimbabwe. And I decided I would drive up and join them. So literally just saw friends off at the airport in Cape Town and got in my car and drove without stopping through the nights, 2 nights. And I got to Mana pools in Zimbabwe and I said, I have to start my own business. What do you call it? Kitty's Travel or whatever. And Letitia said, why don't you call it Rufaro, which is a Zimbabwean word. It means happiness. Any Zimbabwean you meet and you say Rufaro, they all smile and laugh and say happiness. So to travel happily is why it's called Rufaro.
Yeah, you travel happily. It's the Shona equivalent but much more so than
Bon
to
voyage.
safari. Yeah. One thing about that Kenya trip, the camel, if I was the oldest person in that group, and towards the end my body felt it, if you see that there's a camel safari, you think you'll be doing most of the traveling on the camel, but in fact the camels really were for the cargo.
Just to take the luggage.
We walked up mountains, through rivers, up to your armpits. It was exhausting. And the riding camels were waiting at the campsite in case the kids wanted to gallop around a bit. Had I known beforehand, I would have probably said, I can't do it. But afterwards, I was glad that I did. So sometimes foreknowledge can be a disadvantage, but that was a wonderful, wonderful trip. Thank you for organizing.
One personal story I would like to add to your itinerary is that when we went down to Antarctica, we also went to the Crater Lake Deception Island that you explained, and we also decided to go swimming in the so-called hot artesian waters. Except when we got there was no hot water, and I had to swim in the icy cold water in amongst the ice blocks that were drifting in the water. And it was icy cold, and I was blue all over by the time I got back onto the beach. But on board, I was given a certificate which said, you are now a member of the Hot Tub Club, except there was no hot water.
No, ours was hot. Gosh, it was hot.
Well, Kitty, thank you very much for this fascinating tours and the highlights. I'm sure that we can all tell about the highlights we've experienced, and there's so many to visit in so many parts of the world. One could go on and on and on. Thank you, and thank you for the preparation, and all the best to you. And I hope that certainly that by next year that the travel industry will be booming again. And good luck to you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you.